Tonight, we travel to a place where ink became more powerful than armies, where words written by candlelight would echo through centuries, where a handful of men in a sweltering Philadelphia chamber dared to imagine that humanity might govern itself without kings. We descend into the sacred stillness of the American founding, where revolution was not merely fought with muskets, but was dreamed into existence through quills and parchment, through midnight debates and impossible compromises, through the courage of men who signed their names, knowing those signatures might become their death warrants. The Founding Fathers did not merely create a government. They attempted something that had never succeeded in human history, a republic designed to endure, a system of self-governance that would outlast its creators. Tonight we explore their secrets, the forgotten conversations in candlelit rooms, the private doubts that never reached the public record, the sacred uncertainty of men building something they could not fully see. Let the modern world fade. Let the noise of the present dissolve into silence. Let us enter the world where a nation was written into being, where philosophy became constitution, where the dreams of ancient Athens were given one more chance to survive. The evening deepens, the parchment waits, and we begin. Before we settle into the evening's gentle journey, before we allow sleep's approach to soften the edges of consciousness, let us stand for a moment at the threshold between our world and theirs, between the present and the past, understanding what we are about to explore and why these men and their impossible experiment still matter, even in our modern age. The Founding Fathers were not the marble statues we have made of them. They were flesh and blood, prone to doubt and contradiction, capable of both profound wisdom and terrible blindness. They argued viciously with one another, held grudges that lasted decades, made compromises that haunted their consciences until death. They created a nation that proclaimed liberty while permitting slavery, that declared all men equal while denying equality to most. They were, in short, human, and their humanity is what makes their achievement remarkable rather than inevitable. What they attempted had never worked before. Every republic in history had eventually fallen, Athens to mob rule, Rome to emperors, the Italian city-states to tyrants. The founders knew this history intimately, had studied it by candlelight through countless nights, and they understood that the odds were against them. They were not building on solid ground, but on hope, on philosophy, on the untested belief that human beings could govern themselves if given the proper structures and safeguards. Tonight we explore their world, but we do so slowly, letting each discovery unfold at its own pace, allowing the knowledge to settle gently rather than rushing toward completion. We will move through 12 chapters, each exploring a different aspect of how the founders created a nation from words and will, how they built institutions from arguments and compromise, how they structured their own limitations into a government designed to outlast their deaths. We will sit in their meeting rooms, feeling the heat of Philadelphia summers and the heat of passionate debate. We will read over their shoulders as they wrote letters confessing doubts they never voiced publicly. We will watch them sign documents that might have been their death warrants, watch them shake hands with enemies for the sake of the Union, watch them grow old still arguing about what they had created and what it meant. We will follow them to their graves and beyond, into the legacy they left and the questions they could not answer. The founders were not demigods. They were men, educated men, wealthy men, men of their time with all the limitations that implies. But they were also men who dared to believe that government could be different, that power could be checked, that liberty could be preserved through careful design rather than through the benevolence of rulers. They were wrong about many things, but they were right about enough things that their experiment continues, still imperfect, still contested, still alive. As we move through tonight's exploration, let the modern world's noise fade. Let go of the assumption that the founders had answers we have lost. Instead, let us enter their uncertainty, their fear, their desperate hope that what they were building might somehow survive. They did not know they would succeed. They did not know their words would still govern 3 centuries later. They wrote and argued and compromised in the dark, not knowing what morning would bring. The pace will be gentle. The details will accumulate slowly. Some chapters will take us into the heated debates of constitutional conventions, others into the quiet of personal correspondence, others into the rituals and symbols through which the nation was given form. All will contribute to understanding how a handful of men, gathered in a few buildings in a small colonial city, created something that has endured longer than any of them dared to hope. So settle in. Adjust your pillow one final time. Let the weight of the day release, and prepare to journey to the candlelit chambers of the 18th century, to the quill-scratched parchments that became sacred text, to the impossible dream of self-governance that still struggles to realize itself. The evening deepens. The founders wait in memory. And we begin. We begin not with revolution, but with stillness. The moment before a quill touches parchment, when the air in a Philadelphia chamber holds the weight of what has not yet been written. The summer of 1776 moved slowly through Independence Hall, heat pressing against windows sealed against the noise of the street, against the world that did not yet know what was being born in that silence. The men who gathered there carried more than political grievances. They carried the accumulated weight of centuries of philosophical dreaming, of ancient republics fallen to dust, of whispered hopes that perhaps, humanity might govern itself without kings. The chamber itself was modest by the standards of European power. No gilt ceilings, no throne, no symbols of divine authority. Just wooden chairs arranged in rows, a raised platform for the presiding officer, windows that let in light but also heat that made the summer sessions nearly unbearable. The delegates had agreed to keep the windows closed despite the heat, fearing that their words might escape into the street, that the radical ideas being discussed might reach ears that would report them to the crown. They sweated through their deliberations, wiping foreheads with handkerchiefs, enduring discomfort for the sake of secrecy. The ink they used was iron gall, made from oak growths called galls, mixed with iron sulfate and gum arabic. This ink had particular properties that the founders may or may not have consciously chosen, but that would prove significant. Unlike modern inks that fade over time, iron gall ink actually darkens with age, the iron compounds oxidizing and deepening in color. Documents written in this ink do not disappear into illegibility, but become more emphatic, their words growing bolder as centuries pass. The Declaration of Independence, written in iron gall ink, holds its words more firmly now than when Jefferson first set them down. We watch Jefferson's hand move across the page, forming letters that would echo through centuries. He had been chosen for this task partly because of his reputation for writing, partly because John Adams declined. Understanding that a Virginian author would help unite the southern colonies with the northern ones. Jefferson retreated to his rented rooms, sat at a portable writing desk of his own design, and began to compose. He worked quickly but carefully, drawing on years of reading and thinking about the nature of government, distilling complex philosophy into sentences that ordinary people could understand and repeat. The words he chose were not random. We hold these truths to be self-evident, not we believe or we assert, but we hold. suggesting something grasped and possessed, something that could not be taken away. Self-evident, requiring no proof, no argument, no authority beyond the truth itself. The phrases were designed to be memorable, to be spoken aloud, to be carried in the mind like prayers. Jefferson understood that he was writing not just a legal document, but a piece of rhetoric that would need to inspire courage in those who heard it. The Declaration moved through drafts, through committee revisions, through debates that struck out passages Jefferson had loved. A long section condemning the slave trade was removed, sacrificed to the need for Southern support. Other phrases were tightened, clarified, strengthened by the collective editing of the Congress. Jefferson watched the process with wounded pride, convinced that his original was superior, not yet understanding that the document belonged now to the nation rather than to him. The moment of signing approached. Each man who placed his name on the document was committing treason against the British Crown, an act punishable by hanging. Benjamin Franklin's famous quip, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately," captured the genuine danger. These were not abstract signatories, but targets, men whose names would appear on lists carried by British commanders, men who could be hunted and killed for what they were doing. We watched them sign, one by one, in the relative silence of the chamber. John Hancock wrote large, famously large, his signature a gesture of defiance. Others wrote smaller, their signatures crowded together at the bottom of the parchment. Some hands trembled, some did not. All understood that they were crossing a threshold from which there was no return, that whatever happened next, they had committed themselves irrevocably to the cause. The Declaration was not immediately triumphant. It was one document among many in a war that would last years and nearly fail repeatedly. But the words had been spoken, had been written, had been signed. They could not be unsaid. They would be read aloud in town squares and army camps, would be printed in newspapers and pamphlets, would spread across the colonies like fire across dry grass. The words would outlast the war, would outlast the men who wrote them, would become the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The chapter closes in the stillness after signing, when the delegates dispersed into the Philadelphia streets, carrying with them copies of what they had created. The heat continued to press down. The war continued to threaten defeat. But something had changed. A nation had been declared, had been written into existence, had been given words that would define it for centuries to come. The ink dried slowly on the parchment, darkening already, beginning its long journey toward the permanence it still holds, waiting in its sealed case for the generations who would continue to read and argue about what those words meant and what they required. In the libraries of Virginia and Massachusetts, in the quiet hours when the colonies slept, certain men sat surrounded by the ghosts of dead republics, reading by candlelight about civilizations that had tried and failed to govern without kings. We enter these chambers where dust motes floated in flickering light, where shelves held the accumulated wisdom of Athens and Rome, of the Italian city-states, of every experiment in self-governance that history had recorded. The founders were not inventing democracy, they were remembering it, piecing together fragments of ancient practice like archaeologists reassembling a shattered vessel. The books they read were expensive, difficult to obtain, often imported from England or acquired through networks of like-minded scholars. A gentleman's library was a sign of wealth and education, but for certain of the founders it was something more. A laboratory where ideas could be tested, a conversation with the dead who had faced similar questions centuries before. John Adams's library eventually contained over 3,000 volumes, carefully annotated in his crabbed handwriting, the margins filled with arguments and agreements and questions that the original authors could never answer. They read the Greek historians, Thucydides on the Peloponnesian War, Polybius on the rise of Rome, Plutarch on the lives of great men. They absorbed the lessons of Athenian democracy, how it had flourished briefly and then descended into the chaos of mob rule, how demagogues had manipulated popular passion, how the wisest citizens had been ostracized or executed by their fellow citizens. Athens was both inspiration and warning, proof that democracy was possible, proof that democracy could destroy itself. Rome occupied even more of their attention. The Roman Republic had lasted 5 centuries before falling to the Caesars, had developed institutions and balances that the founders studied intensively. The concept of separated powers, legislative, executive, judicial, came directly from Roman practice. The idea of a senate, of consuls with limited terms, of vetoes and checks, all had Roman origins. But Rome too had failed, had surrendered its liberty to ambitious generals and weak institutions, had traded freedom for order when the Republic could no longer maintain itself. They read Machiavelli, though they rarely admitted it publicly, his name associated with cynicism and tyranny. But Machiavelli had also written about republics, had analyzed what made them strong and what made them vulnerable, had offered practical advice about maintaining liberty that the founders found valuable even when they found it uncomfortable. They read Montesquieu, whose spirit of the laws provided the theoretical framework for much of the Constitution, his analysis of how different governments suited different peoples, his arguments for separated powers as the key to preventing tyranny. The reading was not merely academic. These men were facing practical problems that required practical solutions, and they turned to history for guidance. When debating the structure of the executive, they asked how Rome had handled the problem, how the Italian city-states had balanced authority against liberty. When designing the legislature, they considered the failures of the Polish parliament, where a single veto could block all action, and the successes of the British system, where 2 houses balanced each other. Every choice was made against a backdrop of historical precedent, every innovation justified by reference to ancient wisdom or ancient failure. Madison read Montesquieu until the words blurred. Adams copied passages from Cicero into his notebooks. Jefferson annotated histories of the Roman Senate with notes about what might be adapted and what must be avoided. Hamilton studied the financial systems of European nations, looking for models that might be applied to the new republic's desperate need for credit and revenue. Franklin, oldest of them all, brought memories of decades of reading and diplomatic experience, had met the philosophers of the European Enlightenment, had absorbed their ideas and carried them back across the Atlantic. They were haunted by the knowledge that every republic before them had eventually fallen. This was not pessimism, but realism. The historical record was clear, and the founders respected it too much to ignore it. The question that kept candles burning through the night was not whether they could create a republic, but whether they could create one that would last, one that would contain within its structure the mechanisms to prevent its own destruction. They were attempting something unprecedented, a republic designed from the beginning to resist the forces that had destroyed all previous republics. The solutions they developed emerged from this nocturnal study. The separation of powers was designed to prevent any single faction from gaining complete control. The federal structure was designed to balance national authority against local liberty. The amendment process was designed to allow the Constitution to evolve without requiring revolution. The Bill of Rights was designed to protect individuals against the tyranny of majorities. Every element of the system reflected lessons learned from history's failures. We move through these midnight studies, through the fear that whispered beneath the hope, through the profound uncertainty of men who were attempting something that had never successfully endured. The candles guttered and were replaced. The books accumulated marginal notes and turned pages. The arguments refined themselves through years of reading and discussion. The Constitution they eventually created was less blueprint than prophecy, less certainty than prayer, a document written by men who knew history well enough to fear it, who hoped they had learned enough from the past to create a future that would not repeat it. Benjamin Franklin moved through the world as a man who understood that wisdom often lived in what remained unspoken, in the pause between statements, in the smile that neither confirmed nor denied. We follow him through the courts of Europe where he wore simplicity like a costume, where his plain clothes and unpowdered hair became theatrical statements more powerful than any aristocrat's finery. The French adored him without fully understanding him. The British distrusted him while grudgingly respecting his mind. But beneath the wit, beneath the aphorisms that would fill almanacs for generations, there existed depths that Franklin revealed to no one. He arrived at the Constitutional Convention as the oldest delegate, 81 years old, carried to the sessions in a sedan chair because walking had become too painful, his body failing while his mind remained sharp. He spoke rarely during the debates, conserving his energy, observing more than arguing. When he did speak, the room fell silent, not because he demanded attention, but because his words had been so carefully chosen that every syllable seemed to carry weight. Franklin had been a revolutionary before revolution was popular, had spent decades working for colonial unity, had proposed an early plan of union that the colonies had rejected. He had watched the British Empire from the inside, had served as colonial agent in London, had tried to prevent the rupture that he eventually helped to complete. He understood both sides of the Atlantic in ways that younger men could not, understood the costs of what they were attempting and the impossibility of turning back. His role in the convention was that of mediator, a position he had occupied throughout his life. When debates grew heated, when delegates threatened to walk out, Franklin would intervene with a story or a joke, would diffuse tension through humor rather than confrontation. He proposed the compromise on representation that broke the deadlock between large and small states, not because he believed it was the best solution, but because he understood it was the only solution that all parties could accept. He had learned, through 81 years of dealing with human beings, that the perfect was often the enemy of the possible. The private Franklin was more complex than the public sage. His relationship with his son William, who had remained loyal to the crown and served as royal governor of New Jersey, was a wound that never healed. Father and son had worked together for years, had been close in ways that colonial fathers and sons rarely were. And the breach between them represented Franklin's deepest failure. He died without reconciling with William, without finding words that could bridge the gulf that revolution had created. His final speech to the convention, delivered on the last day, was too long for his weakened voice, so he gave the text to another delegate to read. It was a masterpiece of qualified endorsement, acknowledging the Constitution's flaws while arguing for its adoption. I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, he said, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. He had lived long enough to know that his own certainties had often been wrong, that the wisest position was doubt held loosely, principle held firmly, and the willingness to be surprised. He urged the delegates to sign, not because the document was perfect, but because perfection was impossible, and this was the best they could achieve. I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. The double negative was deliberate. Not certainty, but the absence of certainty about absence. A philosopher's hedge that left room for the future to prove him wrong or right. He asked each delegate who still had objections to doubt a little of his own infallibility and sign anyway. We sit with him in the final years at his home in Philadelphia, receiving visitors who came to see the famous man before he died. He remained curious to the end, conducting experiments, writing letters, working on an autobiography he would never finish. The autobiography itself was strategic, carefully crafted to present the Franklin he wanted remembered, the self-made man, the scientist, the diplomat, while concealing the depths and contradictions that made him human. The chapter rests in the mystery of a man who invented so much, yet claimed so little, who served revolution while craving peace, who understood that the new nation would require not just heroes, but also those who knew how to listen, how to wait, how to find the compromise that allowed the impossible to continue just one more day. He died in April 1790, a few months after Washington's inauguration, having lived just long enough to see the government he had helped create begin its uncertain journey. 20,000 people attended his funeral, the largest gathering Philadelphia had ever seen, mourning not just a man but an era, not just a founder but the last of a generation that had dared to imagine something new. At Monticello, where the Blue Ridge Mountains held the horizon in perpetual embrace, Thomas Jefferson created a world that reflected his contradictions. A temple to liberty built by enslaved hands, a monument to reason designed by a heart that craved beauty above logic. We ascend the mountain slowly, approaching the house that Jefferson spent his life perfecting and never quite finishing, a structure that grew and changed with its owner, that contained hidden mechanisms and secret passages that represented less a home than a physical manifestation of a restless mind. The house itself was experiment as much as dwelling. Jefferson designed and redesigned it constantly, adding rooms and wings, installing devices of his own invention. A revolving bookstand that could hold 5 volumes open at once, a clock in the entrance hall with cannonballs for weights that marked the days of the week as they descended, beds built into alcoves to save space, dumbwaiters that carried food from the basement kitchen so that servants would remain unseen. The mechanical ingenuity reflected a mind that could not leave anything alone, that saw every problem as an invitation to innovation. The library was the heart of the house, eventually containing nearly 7,000 volumes, one of the largest private collections in America. Jefferson cataloged his books according to a system of his own devising, based on the faculties of the human mind, memory, reason, imagination, a philosophical architecture that organized knowledge itself. He read voraciously in multiple languages, corresponded with scientists and philosophers across the world, believed that an educated citizenry was the only foundation upon which a republic could rest. Here he wrote letters by the thousands, his correspondence eventually filling dozens of volumes when published. He wrote to scientists about natural history, to philosophers about the nature of government, to friends about farming and weather and wine. He wrote to political allies and political enemies, sometimes with diplomacy and sometimes with venom, his pen as sharp as any weapon. He wrote to his daughters with tenderness that surprised those who knew only his public persona, revealed in private a capacity for love that his reserve concealed. But the mountain held darker truths as well. Monticello ran on enslaved labor. Over 600 people were enslaved there during Jefferson's lifetime, their work making possible the leisure that allowed his philosophical pursuits. He depended on their skill as craftsmen, their knowledge as farmers, their bodies as the economic foundation of his entire world. He knew slavery was wrong, had written against it in early documents, had proposed plans for gradual emancipation that were never adopted. Yet he did not free his own slaves during his lifetime, remained entangled in an institution he claimed to abhor, left his debt so great that the enslaved community was sold at auction after his death to pay his creditors. The contradiction cannot be resolved. The man who wrote that all men were created equal owned human beings. The philosopher of liberty built his world on unfreedom. The architect of American ideals could not or would not apply those ideals to those who lived and worked within sight of his mountaintop. Scholars have debated his relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who bore children almost certainly fathered by Jefferson, a relationship that cannot be called consent when one party is property and the other is owner. The complexity resists simple judgment, demands that we hold multiple truths simultaneously. We walk through the rooms where he worked, where he dreamed, where he spent his final years increasingly concerned about the nation he had helped create. He worried about the Missouri Compromise, which allowed slavery to expand westward, called it a fire bell in the night that awakened him to the possibility that the Union might not survive its founding contradiction. He worried about the direction of the government, believed it had departed from the principles of the Revolution, saw in the growth of federal power the seeds of tyranny he had fought against. His correspondence with John Adams, renewed after years of bitter estrangement, became a meditation on what they had created and what it meant. Two old men, former enemies, become friends again, wrote to each other about philosophy and history and the strangeness of having lived through the events that were already becoming legend. They debated the nature of aristocracy, the meaning of the Revolution, the possibility that future generations would remember them at all. They became, in these letters, something more than political figures. They became witnesses to their own transformation into history. The chapter fades with the mountain still watching, still holding its secrets, still asking questions that have no comfortable answers. Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, as if history itself had arranged the symbolism. His last coherent words were a question. Is it the 4th? When told that it was or soon would be, he relaxed into final sleep. The mountain remained, the house remained, the contradictions remained, unresolved by death, inherited by the nation he had declared into being. In the gray light before sunrise, on a ledge overlooking the Hudson River, two men who had helped build a nation faced each other with pistols, and America held its breath without knowing it should. We approach Weehawken slowly, through the mist that rose from the water, through the silence that precedes violence, through the strange formality of men preparing to kill each other according to rules that made murder somehow honorable. Alexander Hamilton had been awake all night, writing letters, settling accounts, preparing for a death he seemed to expect, or perhaps to seek. He wrote to his wife Elizabeth with tenderness that he rarely showed in person, confessed his love and his regret, asked her forgiveness for the pain he was about to cause. He wrote instructions for his affairs, for the debts that plagued him despite his fame, for the children who would grow up without him. He wrote with the deliberation of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Aaron Burr had been wounded too many times by Hamilton's words. For years, Hamilton had opposed him, had blocked his advancement, had whispered accusations that destroyed his reputation. When Burr ran for governor of New York and lost, he blamed Hamilton's interference. When a newspaper reported that Hamilton had expressed a despicable opinion of Burr at a dinner party, Burr demanded an explanation. Hamilton refused to apologize or explain. The correspondence escalated, each letter more formal and more deadly, until there was no option left except the one that waited at Weehawken. The dueling ground was chosen for its isolation, a narrow ledge accessible only by boat, screened from view by trees and rock. Dueling was illegal in both New York and New Jersey, so the location had to offer plausible deniability, had to be a place where what happened might never be officially acknowledged. The same ground had been used for other duels, had seen other men face each other with pistols, had witnessed Hamilton's own son Philip fall 3 years earlier, killed in a duel on this very spot in defense of his father's honor. The morning was still, the Hudson calm below, the early light filtering through the trees. The seconds made their preparations, measuring the distance, loading the pistols, reciting the rules that governed this particular form of violence. Hamilton and Burr stood at their marks, pistols at their sides, waiting for the command to raise and fire. What passed through their minds in those final seconds we cannot know. Both had risked death before, had served in the Revolution, had faced dangers that should have killed them. But this was different. This was chosen, deliberate, a ritual that could be stopped at any moment if either man would bend. What happened next has been disputed for 2 centuries. Hamilton's second claimed that Hamilton had intended to waste his shot, to fire into the air or into the ground, refusing to kill even while risking death. Burr's second claimed that Hamilton fired first, that the shot went wild, that Burr's response was self-defense. The physical evidence supports neither account conclusively. What is certain is that both pistols fired, that Hamilton fell, that the bullet had struck him in the abdomen and lodged near his spine. He did not die immediately. He was carried down to the boat, rowed back across the river to Manhattan, brought to the home of a friend where he lingered for 30 hours in increasing agony. He was conscious for much of that time, received visitors, said goodbye to his wife and children, made peace with whatever God he believed in. He died the following afternoon, 47 years old, the architect of American financial stability, the author of most of the Federalist Papers, the man who had imagined a nation of commerce and industry rising to rival the empires of Europe. Burr fled south to avoid prosecution, eventually returning to finish his term as vice president, never tried for the killing, never officially punished. But his career was destroyed, his reputation ruined, his name became synonymous with treachery and ambition unchecked by honor. He would spend years in exile, would be tried for treason in a separate scheme to create an independent nation in the Western Territories, would die old and forgotten, having outlived everyone who had known him when he mattered. The chapter rests in the mystery of why men who had risked everything for a nation's birth would risk destroying each other, of what honor meant to those who had reimagined everything except this ancient ritual of blood. The duel was archaic even in 1804, a holdover from an earlier age when gentlemen settled disputes with violence rather than courts. Hamilton and Burr both knew better. Hamilton had written against dueling, had called it murder dressed in formality, yet both walked onto that ledge when the time came, bound by codes they could not escape even when they saw them clearly for what they were. In the private correspondence of the founders, in letters written by candlelight and carried by riders across muddy roads, there existed a nation more honest than the one that appeared in public documents, a conversation more uncertain than the confident declarations that history remembered. We enter the archives where these letters rest, fragile pages holding words that were never meant for posterity, confessions of doubt and fear, arguments that grew heated and personal, friendships that broke and sometimes healed. Letter writing was an art for these men, a discipline learned in youth and practiced throughout their lives. They drafted letters carefully, sometimes making multiple copies, always aware that their words might be shared or published, yet still revealing more in correspondence than they ever did in public speeches. The letters were how they conducted business, maintained relationships, debated ideas too dangerous for public forums. The mail was slow and unreliable. A letter might take weeks to reach its destination, might be lost or intercepted, yet they wrote constantly, flooding the postal system with arguments and updates and pleas. The letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson form the most remarkable correspondence in American history. They had stood together at the beginning, had served in the Continental Congress, had collaborated on the Declaration of Independence. Adams had nominated Jefferson to write it, recognizing his colleague's gift for language. They had served together as diplomats in Europe, had been friends in the way that men who share extraordinary experiences become friends, bound by what they had witnessed and accomplished. But politics had torn them apart. The partisan warfare of the 1790s placed them in opposite camps, Adams a Federalist, Jefferson leading the Republicans. The election of 1800 was bitter, personal, vicious, both sides accusing the other of tyranny and corruption, of betraying everything the Revolution had meant. Jefferson won, and Adams left Washington before the inauguration, unable to witness his rival's triumph, the friendship apparently destroyed beyond repair. For 12 years they did not speak or write. Mutual friends attempted reconciliation, urged them to remember what they had shared, but the wounds seemed too deep. Then, in 1812, Adams broke the silence. He sent Jefferson a brief letter, testing whether communication might resume. Jefferson responded warmly, and the correspondence began again, slowly at first, then with increasing frequency and depth. For the remaining 14 years of their lives, they wrote to each other about philosophy and history, about the meaning of what they had created, about the strangeness of having become monuments while still alive. The letters are remarkable for their candor. Adams confessed his vanity, his sensitivity to criticism, his fear that history would not remember him fairly. Jefferson revealed his doubts about the direction of the nation, his worry that the principles of the Revolution were being abandoned. They disagreed about fundamental things, the nature of aristocracy, the role of government, the meaning of equality, but they debated with the freedom of men who had nothing left to prove, who valued truth over victory. We read the letters that were deliberately destroyed, the correspondence between Washington and his generals that was burned for security, the private communications that families protected from public view, the words that were too honest or too dangerous to survive. Washington's heirs burned many of his papers, protecting his reputation from revelations that might have humanized the monument. Jefferson asked that certain letters be destroyed after his death, though some survived despite his wishes. Madison edited his own papers extensively, removing passages that might embarrass himself or others. What remains is fragment, is partial truth, is the knowledge that the founders' actual thoughts were more complex than what they allowed to be preserved. They were constructing their own legacies as deliberately as they constructed the government, selecting what would survive and what would perish, creating the mythology that would replace the reality. We read their letters knowing that we are reading what they wanted us to read, that beneath the surviving words lie the destroyed words, the thoughts they could not commit to paper, the truths they carried to their graves. The chapter moves through the silence where letters should be, through the gaps in the historical record, through the understanding that the founders were as careful with their words as with their politics. The letters that survive give us glimpses of the men behind the monuments, their petty jealousies and genuine friendships, their doubts and fears and hopes. But the letters that were burned remind us that there is always more than the record shows, always depth beyond the archive, always human complexity that documents cannot capture. In a private dinner hosted by Thomas Jefferson, with only Alexander Hamilton and James Madison present, the shape of America was negotiated over wine and candlelight, the location of a capital traded for the assumption of debts, geography exchanged for finance, the future distributed among men who understood that governing required compromise that principle alone could never achieve. The dinner occurred in June 1790 at Jefferson's residence in New York, then the temporary capital. Jefferson had recently returned from France, had missed the Constitutional Convention, was still catching up on the political situation that had developed in his absence. He was serving as Secretary of State in Washington's cabinet, alongside Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and the two men were already discovering how deeply they disagreed about the direction of the nation. Hamilton's financial plan was in trouble. He wanted the federal government to assume the debts that states had accumulated during the Revolution, to consolidate all the wartime borrowing into a single national debt that the federal government would pay. The plan was brilliant financially. It would establish American credit, create a class of investors with stake in the nation's success, fund the government through predictable revenues. But it was politically explosive. States that had already paid their debts resented being taxed to pay the debts of states that had not. Virginia, which had paid much of its debt, would subsidize Massachusetts, which had not. The proposal was stuck in Congress, blocked by representatives from states that saw themselves as losers in the deal. Madison was leading the opposition. He had been Hamilton's ally during the ratification debates, had co-authored the Federalist Papers with him, but now found himself opposing the Treasury Secretary's plans. Madison believed the assumption was unfair, that it rewarded fiscal irresponsibility, that it concentrated too much power in the federal government. The debate had become bitter, personal, threatening to paralyze the new government before it had accomplished anything. Jefferson brought them together, claimed later that he did so without fully understanding the issues, that he merely provided a venue for negotiation. This was almost certainly false. Jefferson was too intelligent and too experienced to be merely an innocent host. But the fiction served his purposes, allowed him to claim credit for the compromise without being blamed for its costs. The dinner was private, unrecorded, its details known only through the participants' later recollections, which differed in significant ways. What emerged was a trade. Hamilton would get his assumption of state debts, would establish the financial system he believed essential for national survival. In exchange, Madison and Jefferson would get the capital moved south, away from the commercial centers of New York and Philadelphia, to a new city to be built on the Potomac River near Virginia. The capital would rise from swampland that had never been a seat of power, would be designed from scratch, would represent the agrarian vision that Jefferson and Madison believed should define the nation. The bargain was not principle, but practicality. Neither side got everything. Hamilton had wanted the capital to remain in New York, where commerce was centered. Madison had wanted to defeat assumption entirely. Both accepted less than they wanted because they understood that the alternative was deadlock, was a government that could not function, was the failure of the experiment before it had truly begun. They compromised because they had to, because the nation required it, because getting something was better than getting nothing. We sit with the irony of this bargain. The capital that Jefferson and Madison won would eventually become a city of power far greater than they imagined, a center of federal authority that would have horrified them. The financial system that Hamilton won would create the economic foundation for industrial expansion that would transform the agrarian republic into something entirely different. Both sides got what they wanted, and both sides would have been dismayed by what their victories produced. The chapter rests in the mystery of what else was said that night. What other understandings passed between men who knew that the nation they had created was fragile? The dinner was one evening in a process that took months, that involved many other conversations and negotiations and adjustments. But it has become the symbol of compromise itself, the moment when the founders demonstrated that governing required more than principle, that survival demanded flexibility, that the Constitution was not enough without the willingness to bargain. When George Washington announced he would not seek a third term, when he published the address that would guide the nation for generations, he was teaching America something it had never had the chance to learn: that power could be surrendered voluntarily, that the man who held authority could choose to walk away, that the republic might actually survive the loss of its essential figure. Washington was exhausted. The presidency had aged him beyond his 64 years, had consumed the energy that remained after decades of military and political service, had subjected him to attacks that wounded him more deeply than any battlefield injury. The partisan press had grown vicious, had accused him of monarchical ambitions, had compared him to tyrants, had published mockeries that made him rage in private while maintaining public dignity. He longed for Mount Vernon, for his fields and his family, for the peaceful retirement he had thought he was achieving when he resigned his military commission after the Revolution. He could have stayed. The Constitution set no limit on presidential terms, and he would certainly have been elected again. His popularity, though diminished by partisan attack, remained sufficient to guarantee victory. But he understood that staying would establish a precedent more dangerous than leaving. If he served until death, the presidency might become functionally hereditary, might attract ambitious men who would cling to power rather than release it, might become the very monarchy he had fought against. By leaving, he established that the office belonged to the nation, not the man, that power was held in trust and must eventually be returned. The farewell address was not delivered as a speech, but published as a letter in a Philadelphia newspaper, the text crafted over months with the help of Hamilton and Madison, polished and revised until every phrase carried precisely the meaning Washington intended. It was designed for permanence, for future generations to read and heed, for moments of crisis when the nation might need the founders' guidance. The warnings it contained were specific. He warned against partisan division, against the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension. He had watched the Federalists and Republicans tear at each other, had seen friendships destroyed and reputations ruined by political warfare, and he feared that such division would eventually destroy the Union itself. The parties might differ on policy, but they must not differ on the fundamental commitment to constitutional government, must not treat their opponents as enemies to be destroyed. He warned against foreign entanglement, against permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. The nation was weak, could be drawn into European conflicts that would exhaust its resources and destroy its independence. Better to maintain commercial relations with all nations and political connections with none, to stay out of the wars that perpetually ravaged the old world, to protect the new world's possibility of something different. This advice would guide American foreign policy for over a century, would be cited by presidents seeking to avoid involvement in distant conflicts. He warned against regional loyalty that might override national unity, against the tendency to identify with North or South, East or West, rather than with America as a whole. The Union was the foundation of all prosperity and liberty. Without it, the separate regions would become separate nations, would likely fall to conflict with each other or domination by foreign powers. The states had strength only in combination. Divided, they would be weak, vulnerable, eventually conquered. The actual departure was quieter than any battle. On March 4, 1797, Washington attended the inauguration of John Adams, stood as a private citizen while power passed to his successor, then walked through the Philadelphia streets toward his lodgings. The crowd that watched him pass understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. A leader surrendering authority without compulsion, without defeat, without death. Kings did not abdicate willingly. Generals did not disband their armies voluntarily. But Washington was showing that Republican leaders could do both, that the experiment might actually work. We follow him home to Virginia, to the fields and the family he had sacrificed for the nation, to the final years of a life that had carried burdens no American before him had ever borne. He returned to farming with relief, to the management of his estates, to the pleasures of grandchildren and neighbors, and the quiet routine of country life. He had less than 3 years remaining, would die suddenly in December 1799 from a throat infection that his doctors made worse through aggressive treatment. His final words were instructions about his burial, practical matters, the consciousness of a man who had managed his public image all his life, managing it until the end. The chapter fades with the understanding that his greatest gift to the nation was not victory but departure, not power held but power released, not the precedent of leadership but the precedent of letting go. In the final hours of John Adams's presidency, as candles burned through the night and clerks prepared commissions, a desperate attempt to shape the future was unfolding. Appointments to federal courts that would outlast the administration, judges who would serve for life, a judiciary that would carry Federalist principles into an era that had rejected them at the ballot box. Adams had lost. The election of 1800 had gone to Jefferson after a bitter campaign and a confused electoral college result that threw the decision to the House of Representatives. For weeks, the outcome had been uncertain, the possibility of deadlock or even civil conflict hanging over the nation. When Jefferson finally emerged as president-elect, Adams faced a choice: accept defeat gracefully or use his remaining weeks in office to embed Federalist influence wherever he could. He chose to fight. Working with the lame duck Federalist Congress, he pushed through the Judiciary Act of 1801, which created new circuit courts and judgeships, reducing the Supreme Court's burden while also creating positions that Adams could fill before leaving office. He then worked frantically to nominate Federalist loyalists to every available seat, signing commissions until the final hours of his presidency, literally working by candlelight on his last night in office while clerks prepared the documents that would give his appointments legal force. These midnight judges became symbols of partisan manipulation, of using judicial appointments to circumvent the will of the voters. Jefferson and his allies were furious, moved quickly to repeal the Judiciary Act, tried to remove Federalist judges through impeachment. The conflict between the branches would define the early years of the new administration, would establish the boundaries of judicial power, would determine whether the courts could serve as a check on the elected branches or would be subordinate to them. One appointment mattered more than all the others: John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Marshall was Adams's Secretary of State, was a Federalist loyalist, was 45 years old, and would serve for 34 years, shaping American constitutional law more profoundly than any judge before or since. The appointment was made in January, confirmed quickly by the Senate, and Marshall began serving while still completing his duties as Secretary of State, the urgency of the moment requiring doubled responsibilities. Marshall would establish that the Supreme Court had the power to declare laws unconstitutional, would assert this power in Marbury v. Madison, a case arising directly from the midnight appointments. The irony was perfect. Adams's desperate attempt to maintain Federalist influence produced the case that established judicial review, that gave the court power neither the Constitution nor the Founders had explicitly granted. That made the judiciary a co-equal branch rather than the weakest of the three. The decision was brilliant strategically. Marshall found that William Marbury was entitled to his commission, that Adams had lawfully appointed him, and Jefferson's administration was wrong to withhold the appointment. But then Marshall declared that the court could not order Jefferson to deliver the commission because the law giving the court that power was itself unconstitutional. By ruling against the immediate Federalist claim, Marshall avoided a confrontation with Jefferson that he would have lost. By establishing the principle of judicial review, he gained a power far more valuable than any single appointment. We sit with the irony that Adams's midnight desperation produced the most consequential judicial appointment in American history. That defeat carried within it a strange victory, that the Federalist vision survived through the courts long after it had died in the elected branches. The court that Adams created in his final hours would interpret the Constitution for the next 2 centuries, would limit legislative power and expand executive authority, would protect individual rights and enforce federal supremacy, would become an institution the Founders did not entirely foresee and might not have approved. The chapter closes with Adams leaving Washington before dawn on Inauguration Day, unable to watch Jefferson take the oath, returning to Massachusetts and the obscurity he both feared and desired. He would live another quarter century, would watch the nation change in ways that sometimes pleased and sometimes horrified him, would reconcile with Jefferson and die on the same day, their lives bookended by coincidences that seemed designed by Providence. But his lasting influence came not from his presidency, but from his final appointments, from the judges who would outlast him, from the court that would remember Federalist principles long after the Federalist Party itself was forgotten. When British forces burned the Capitol in 1814, the Library of Congress, the nation's collection of knowledge, still young and incomplete, was reduced to ash and memory. We stand in the ruins where books had been, where the accumulated wisdom that the Founders had believed essential to self-governance had been deliberately destroyed, where the enemy had understood that burning a library was burning a nation's mind. The War of 1812 had gone badly. The invasion of Canada had failed, the British Navy had blockaded American ports, and in August 1814, a British force landed in Maryland and marched toward Washington. The American defenders fled after a brief battle at Bladensburg, and the capital lay open to the enemy. President Madison had escaped into the countryside. Dolly Madison had famously rescued Washington's portrait from the White House, but no one had thought to protect the Library of Congress. The British commander, Admiral George Cockburn, ordered the Capitol burned. The flames consumed everything: the legislative chambers where laws had been debated, the offices where committees had worked, the library where 4,000 volumes had been collected over 14 years. The fire was deliberate, punitive, designed to humiliate the upstart nation that had dared to challenge British power. The soldiers reportedly made a bonfire of the books, feeding the flames with volumes that represented years of careful acquisition. From these ashes came an unexpected gift. Thomas Jefferson, in retirement at Monticello, heard of the destruction and saw an opportunity. His personal library was the largest and finest in America, nearly 7,000 volumes accumulated over 50 years, books in multiple languages on every subject, organized according to a philosophical system of his own devising. He offered to sell it to Congress, to replace what had been lost with something even greater, to give the nation his life's collection. The offer was controversial. Federalists objected to purchasing books from a man they still considered a dangerous radical. Some complained about the price, nearly $24,000, a substantial sum for a government at war. Others worried about the contents. Jefferson's library included books on philosophy and religion that some considered inappropriate for a national collection. But Congress eventually agreed, and the books were packed into wagons and shipped from Monticello to Washington. The library was Jefferson's mind made physical, his curiosity rendered in volumes. He had organized the books according to a classification system based on Francis Bacon's categories of knowledge: memory, reason, imagination, which he elaborated into 44 subcategories, covering everything from ancient history to modern science, from theology to fine arts. This system became the basis for how the Library of Congress would organize knowledge for the next century, Jefferson's philosophical framework shaping how Americans would categorize human understanding. We move through the catalog of what Jefferson offered. There were books in French, Spanish, Italian, Latin, Greek, languages Jefferson had mastered over decades of study. There were treatises on architecture and agriculture, on law and music, on mathematics and natural history. There were books that reflected his scientific interests and books that reflected his political beliefs, books that would have been available in any gentleman's library and books that were rare even then, acquired through years of searching and correspondence with booksellers across Europe. But there was also loss that could not be replaced. The original collection had contained documents and manuscripts, records of early congressional debates, materials that existed in no other copies. These were simply gone, consumed by flames, the knowledge they contained lost forever. Jefferson's books could replace the library's function, but could not restore what had been unique and irreplaceable. The burning had destroyed part of the nation's memory that no purchase could recover. The chapter fades with the understanding that the founders gave the nation not just government, but also the infrastructure of thought, the libraries and universities and institutions of learning that would allow future generations to understand what had been created and to continue creating it anew. Jefferson's library survived only briefly in its original form. Another fire in 1851 destroyed about 2/3 of the collection, but the principle it established endured, that the nation required a library, that democracy depended on access to knowledge, that the light of learning must be protected against the darkness of destruction. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died within hours of each other, as if history itself had written the ending. We sit with this impossibility, this coincidence so profound it feels like providence, this closing of a circle so perfect it seems designed by forces beyond human understanding. The Jubilee celebration had been planned for months. 50 years of independence was an achievement worth honoring, especially since so few remained who remembered the beginning. Of the 56 men who had signed the Declaration, only 3 were still alive. Adams and Jefferson and Charles Carroll of Maryland, who would live another 6 years. The nation was preparing celebrations, parades, and speeches and toasts, a commemoration of the founding that had become history while some of its makers still breathed. Jefferson was failing. He had been in declining health for months, confined to Monticello, receiving few visitors. His finances had collapsed. A lifetime of spending beyond his means had left him deeply in debt, and his family would have to sell Monticello and the enslaved people who worked it after his death. But his mind remained clear, still curious, still writing letters when his body allowed. He was determined to reach the 4th, to survive until the anniversary, as if he could will himself to live for symbolic purposes. Adams was failing too, though more gradually. At 90, he was ancient by the standards of the time, had outlived most of his generation, had become a monument who could remember things no one else remembered. He spent his final days at his home in Quincy, Massachusetts, surrounded by family, drifting between consciousness and sleep, asking occasionally about the date. He too seemed determined to reach the 4th. Jefferson died first in the early afternoon of July 4th at Monticello. His last coherent words had been a question about the date. Is it the 4th? And when told it was, or nearly was, he had seemed satisfied, had slipped into unconsciousness and then death. The doctor who attended him recorded the time. The family began the rituals of mourning. The news began its slow journey to the rest of the nation. Adams died hours later, in the early evening. His last words, according to those present, were, "Thomas Jefferson survives," words already false when spoken, the two men dying on the same day, but separated by hours and by the distance between Virginia and Massachusetts. Adams did not know that his old friend and old enemy was already gone, died believing that Jefferson would outlive him, that the younger man would have the last word as he always seemed to in their long rivalry. The coincidence stunned the nation. News traveled slowly in 1826, so the deaths were not known simultaneously. Communities that learned of one death would later learn of the other, the accumulating information adding to the sense of providence. Sermons were preached finding meaning in the timing, interpreting the dual deaths as divine commentary on the nation's founding, as proof that God had blessed the American experiment. The symbolism was irresistible. The author of the Declaration and the advocate who had proposed him for the task, dying together on the very day their work had created, as if called home by the anniversary they had made possible. We move through the mourning that followed, through the national grief that seemed to transcend partisan divisions, through the recognition that an era had ended and America was now truly on its own. The founding generation was nearly gone. Soon only memories of memories would remain. The men who had been present at the creation would become myths, their complexities smoothed into monuments, their contradictions forgotten in favor of the heroism that was easier to remember. The reconciliation between Adams and Jefferson made their shared death even more poignant. They had been enemies, had wounded each other deeply in the partisan wars, had spent years refusing to communicate. But they had found their way back to friendship, had exchanged hundreds of letters in their final years, had achieved a kind of peace that their public careers had not allowed. Their correspondence had been a meditation on what they had created and what it meant, and now that conversation was complete, ended by deaths that seemed to answer questions the letters had raised. The chapter rests in the mystery of time and meaning, in the question of whether such coincidences are random or designed, in the silence that follows when the last voices who remember the beginning are finally still. The nation would continue, would face crises the founders had feared and crises they could not have imagined, would endure a civil war that nearly destroyed the union they had created. But on that 4th of July in 1826, for a moment, the nation paused to honor what it was losing, to recognize that something irreplaceable was passing, to wonder what it meant that history had arranged so perfect an ending. The Constitution rests now in a sealed case filled with argon gas, protected from the light and air that would destroy it, preserved by technology the founders could never have imagined for a document they hoped would survive forever. We approach this parchment slowly, understanding that we are approaching not just paper and ink, but something closer to sacred text, words that have been argued over and amended, interpreted and reinterpreted, stretched to cover circumstances the writers never foresaw. The document is fragile. Time has faded the ink and darkened the parchment, has made some passages difficult to read, has left its physical marks on the material that carried the nation's fundamental law. The conservation efforts are constant and careful. The case that holds the Constitution is designed to protect against light, against temperature fluctuation, against the oxygen that would allow deterioration to continue. The founders wrote for permanence, but they could not have known what permanence would require. The words remain, though their meaning has shifted with each generation. We, the people, has expanded beyond anything the founders imagined. The people who can vote, who can serve, who can claim the Constitution's protections now include categories the founders excluded or ignored. The document that permitted slavery now prohibits it. The document that mentioned no right to vote now contains amendments protecting that right for races and genders the founders did not contemplate as voters. The Constitution has grown not by adding words, but by changing what the existing words mean. We sit with the mystery of how this works, how a document written by men who owned slaves could become the foundation for civil rights, how a text that excluded women from political consideration could be interpreted to guarantee their equality, how the silences and gaps in the original have become spaces where justice could grow. The founders did not intend much of what the Constitution now means, yet the document they wrote has proven flexible enough to accommodate intentions they did not have, to grow toward ideals they articulated but did not achieve. The arguments continue. Every generation reads the Constitution differently, finds in its phrases support for positions the previous generation rejected, discovers new meanings in old words. The originalists argue that the Constitution means what its writers meant, that interpretation must be bound by historical understanding. The living constitutionalists argue that the document must evolve, must adapt to circumstances the founders could not have foreseen, must mean what justice requires it to mean. Both sides claim the founders' authority. Both sides interpret the founders' silences to support their own conclusions. The parchment cannot settle these disputes. It holds words, but words require interpretation. And interpretation is human activity subject to all the limitations and possibilities of human understanding. The founders knew this, which is why they created a court to interpret and a process to amend, why they did not try to specify everything, but instead established principles that would require ongoing application. They built not a machine, but a living system, not a final answer, but a framework for finding answers. We approach the display case in the National Archives, where tourists line up to see the founding documents, where school groups file past the glass that separates the present from the past. The room is dim, the light carefully controlled to protect the parchment from fading further. The silence is reverent, as in a cathedral. the visitors speaking in whispers as they approach what has become a kind of shrine. The Constitution has become sacred in a secular nation, the closest thing to scripture that American civil religion possesses. The document breathes, not because the parchment is alive, but because each generation breathes new meaning into it. Because the conversation the founders began continues in courtrooms and legislatures, in classrooms and living rooms, in every argument about what America is and what it should become. The founders gave us not answers but questions, not final solutions but frameworks for seeking solutions, not certainty but a process for navigating uncertainty. The chapter fades without conclusion because the story has no conclusion. The Constitution still governs, still evolves, still asks whether the experiment that began in that Philadelphia summer can continue. The founders are gone, their voices silenced by death, their intentions preserved imperfectly in documents that cannot answer the questions we want to ask. But their work remains, fragile parchment in a sealed case, words that still carry the weight of law, a nation still struggling to become what they declared it already was. The silence holds, the parchment waits, and the conversation continues, as it has for more than 2 centuries, as it will continue as long as Americans still believe that words on paper can hold a nation together, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, can endure. That the dream born in a sweltering Philadelphia chamber might somehow, against all the odds that history teaches, survive.